We've had a really interesting collection of topics today, and so I thought I'd start off just by reminding everybody of what we've heard today. Sarah started with the importance of natural flow regimes and functional flows. Daniele gave us a tutorial on hyperrete exchange and some really interesting results about biogeochemical processes that they're observing. Todd talked about the history of fine sediment in the river and the successes with managing that and then setting current and future targets. Dave talked about gravel augmentation and routing of that sediment and the difficulties with the original ideas and thinking about new ways of doing it. Scott talked about the history of coarse sediment management and active bars. James presented on riparian vegetation and summer base flows and provided some suggestions for future experiments that the program might do based on the synthesis reports. And then Connor wrapped it up with the evolution of channel form and restoration paradigms that the program has gone through and what they've learned over time. So the format is we have online questions that I'll start with one or two of those. And then if the audience has questions, please come down and come up to the microphone so that everyone can hear them. So the first question is for Sarah. This is an online question. And the question is, you mentioned the coupling of hydrology and geomorphology and how they work in sync. And we've seen different eras of flow management about every 20 years and are on our way to a new era. So each time we've significantly changed the flow regimes, which has resulted potentially in changes in geomorphology to the river. So do we need to reshape the channel for every one of these eras and future ones? So that it boils down to if we have solving problems with the channel being out of sync with future or past flows.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a good one. It's an interesting one because I think even hearing the talks today of what Scott and Connor were talking about, the ability for modified and heavily regulated rivers to adjust and be able to come back into sync is an interesting question and something that I think we're still exploring. So I think we can look to our reference rivers and understand how flows and sediment and channel form all work together. And then as we are trying to restore and recover from a lot of impacts that have happened both to the channel and to the flow regime, it becomes a bit of an iterative process, right? If I adjust one factor, there's going to be a cascading effect on other factors in the system. And then you go and adjust, for example, channel form, and then there'll be cascading effects. And so that's really the challenge. That's the challenge that the program has been trying to address, the monitor's been able to address. And so as you move forward, I think the continued experiments that folks have talked about, the comments today about addressing riparian vegetation and the ability for the channel to readjust, I think are really key and important. And we know from what we've learned over the last couple of decades that more natural flow regimes are ultimately what's going to be needed for the species, but that has to be coupled with the channel. So learning what is it about the channel that is able to adjust or not able to adjust, or how it works in the confined sections, I think is a key aspect. I don't think you necessarily, there's 10 levers. Which one do you pull at a time? Do you pull 5 levers at one time and try to evaluate those? Do you pull 1 lever at a time and wait to evaluate? I think it's a good question, and I don't think there's an easy answer. So I don't have an easy answer. I don't know if somebody else wants to comment.
Yeah, it struck me that this fits in with what Connor was just talking about. I don't know if you have any thoughts or anyone else on the panel. Feel free.
I guess the comment I had is that, in restoration design, what we try to teach in documents and philosophy is that one of the big things that we've said is to remove constraints from the channel. Remove constraints from natural processes. So the more that we can remove those constraints, the more the system is more robust to adopt a change. And the change, if there's room to have those adjustments. But if it's constrained by a highway, a bridge, and movable tailings, it doesn't have much room to adjust. But if it's got a wide floodplain, it can pull back if the flows go down. It can expand if it flows go up.
Yeah, and I guess from my perspective, I view it too as just part of the adaptive management. If we're learning to do the flows better, that may mean rethinking how we're doing the channels, but that's just part of the process. So, the next question is for Daniele. The question is that dredge mining has completely destroyed the heterogeneity of permeability in the stream bed in many areas of the Trinity River. And you've worked in dredge systems and you know what those dredging operations do. So how do you think this has affected the biogeochemical processes in the stream bed of the Trinity River watershed?
Can you hear me now? Yeah. So this is quite a very important question and also very difficult to answer because the impact of a biogeochemistry that occurs in the natural streams depend on the interactions. Okay, the interaction between the flow, the bed forms, and the hydraulic conductivity of the stream bed. So simplified systems will have also a more simplified hyporheic that occurs. So if we have a less roughness in the stream bed, that means that we will eliminate those shallow hyporheic that could be present there that can impact reaction biogeochemistry that have a short reaction rate. And some of those could be nitrification, the nitrification that occurs in the stream bed, but also how phosphorus moves through the systems and how also organism that lives there evolved in those parts. So as the systems with tailing becomes more simplified, we have less sinuosity, so we lose all those flow line that goes between meanders. So we eliminate another portion of the hyporheic. So if we try to simplify the systems, we started to eliminate the short flow lines. We start to eliminate some long flow line that goes into the floodplain. So eventually also the reaction rate that may occur into the stream bed might become less effective. So we have less reactions. What it could also happen is the fact that we have a larger substrate. So on the top, the way that the dredged work was to leave a larger particle on the surface. So now we have cobbles or other large systems that are present there, and maybe less fine sediment. So we have a faster flow that moves through that shallow hyporheic, which eventually has less retention times, and so potentially less biogeochemistry that can occur in the systems. So not knowing exactly how the Trinity River works, just from this principal analysis, that what I could expect is probably a more simplified system, so with less reaction and transformation.
Yeah, and it strikes me that there'd be less diversity of hyporheic flow and habitats that we've been talking about, and how that diversity is really important for organisms to take refuge or to live their lives.
Exactly. Yeah. So there is potentially a reduction also the hyporheic, so those organisms that lives into the stream bed.
Any other thoughts? I know you guys aren't hyporheic experts, but okay. The next question is for Scott, and the question is: piggyback flows were recommended to be explored in the flow study. And do you think that higher discharges achievable through accretions would increase active bars as the river accessed sediments previously that were previously in long-term storage?
So I think.
Can you hold the mic a little closer?
Right. Yeah. So I think I mentioned earlier that that was something that was evaluated and we tried to address. But just because of the risk management of doing piggybacking, we weren't allowed to do that. So I think it would help on the active bar metric, just provided that we have enough supply. I'm not convinced that we are going to be like recruiting a lot of sediment from like channel migration, like Connor shared with us. So I think that's part of the reason that, you know, it's one of the other benefits of gravel augmentation. And it kind of gets maybe to the first question too, just about, you know, changes in channel dimensions or flows, is that by making, you know, we kind of designed that program to be self-maintaining as much as we could at the time, specifically to avoid doing mechanical maintenance as much as we could. So gravel or sediment augmentation was a key part of that with high flows, so that the channel could adjust its dimensions in response to changes in flows. And so, like, you know, the example that you had given of, it's not just the bankful flows, it's the full range of flows that will cause channel dimension changes on, you know, a storm-based time step, for example, on the big flood. So that's part of the reason that I kind of emphasize the gravel part. I know there's some concerns with it, but having that supply, and then in addition with wood, which we neglected in the flow study, we can give the river the building blocks that it can ebb and, you know, the dimensions can ebb and flow, and we don't have to manage channel width, for example. The river can do that on its own, and widening, narrowing, depending on the storm sequences or safety dam or dam releases.
Any questions from the audience? Don't be shy. Okay, I'll give you a minute to think. I'll go back to the online questions. Actually, this is a question I have for Dave. Have you, you know, one of the things you showed is that in some places, the gravel that's augmented and injected into the river doesn't travel very far. That's not always the case, but it is in some cases. And sort of the rule of thumb I used to teach students is in gravel bed rivers, poor riffle channels, you know, the sediment moves slowly. It moves from one bar to another bar during a bankful flow, a flow that can mobilize the sediment. So I sort of have an expectation that, yeah, maybe the stuff moves slowly, but it seems like it's really being trapped in some of your locations. So the question is, have you compared your transport rates to what others have observed beyond your discussions with Hervé? You know, are you way out on the limb of the typical distribution, or are you doing okay and you just need to wait longer to see that stuff move?
Yeah, no, I don't think it's out on the limb. You know, one thing that comes to mind is a study I saw when I was working on the Missouri, and I was working with Rob Jacobson there, and he had published a paper in the Ozarks where they had looked at some Ozark streams, you know, that where you could see these places where the bed material was accumulating in the same spot for decades, you know, and I think that that's a very common way things work with bed, you know, with coarse bed load. Is it finds a place where there is a place for it to drop out and be stored, and it'll continue to do that for a short period of time if you're thinking geologically, but if you're thinking like we sometimes think, it's a long time, and then somewhere along the lines something happens, you have an extreme event or just some kind of geomorphic threshold gets crossed, and then that accumulation area then becomes a source area. But the timescales are maybe more than what we often recognize. And just incidentally, I did a similar thing happened in Grass Valley Creek, and I had done a pit tags project up there starting in 2008, where we started augmenting gravel below Buckhorn Dam, and that material did exactly the same thing. It went a little ways downstream into where there had been a pool, and it filled the pool up, and then it built a big bar. So now there's a big gravel bar sitting where the pool used to be. And because that stuff stopped, and then the material that used to be floodplain, which was a lot of DG up in there, went away. And so it's just, you know, whatever's hardest to move stops and something else goes, you know. So anyway, so I think that is, you know, storing coarse sediment for extended periods is not an unusual thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I also thought it was a great idea to maybe experiment with decreasing the size of the material injected it should be more mobile. And if you're also supplementing fine materials, that'll help mobilize the whole thing. And so that might give you a more dynamic system, or at least disperse that injection further downstream.
Yeah, and I think the idea of adding, having some finer material in there will help disperse it more. One thing that I do kind of think about with that is that, I mean, do we really want it to disperse more? Because, we're the faster it disperses, the more we have to keep feeding it. And so we're kind of, maybe we want it to hang around, and especially if it's creating some kind of channel complexity or something like that. And I guess I just would throw out the idea because, we mentioned the idea of like, well, let's make it smaller so it's more mobile. But I think at the same time, we can also say, hey, let's make it bigger, because there's places where I've recommended, I don't think it's going to happen, but we're talking about where can we augment material. And I'm like, well, you could put it here, but let's put in oversized material here, not because we want this to be mobile and go supply sediment, but because it'll blow that section of channel up. And that would be another objective, just blow it up.
Yeah, in the same way, I was wondering, the first site you talked about where the gravel ended up, and I was wondering if you could put boulders or other structures in there to create jets and direct it to get it out of that trap, if that's one of your goals.
Yeah, I got to mention this. I think where's Todd? Yeah, we should talk about that. The little augmentation thing we did, just that happened this year. I mean, this plays into this, right? I haven't seen that. I saw it the other day, but I never saw it after it was built, though, so I don't know.
Is this a secret thing, or can you describe to us what it is?
So the story here is that there was an augmentation made in the hatchery reach. That material moved down and plugged a side channel entrance, one of the largest side channel complexes we have on the river. And so the idea was to open that side channel entrance, and that moved gravel with loaders and downstream below the side channel entrance would be available for river transport during this year's high flow release. I heard from Mike that looking at that gravel pile, it was 5,500 cubic yards or something like that, just built as a high transverse bar detached from the banks, probably a third out into the channel where it's doing a gentle meander with a immovable outside wall. And it sounds like at least a good share of that gravel still there. Is that the case?
I really can't say because I never saw it before the flow came up. But there's a narrow strip of gravel a little ways offshore from that island, or from that wooded area, and it's still
Yeah, which so Mike is nodding yes. So a lot of that gravel's still there. We'll figure out what to do with it, but the expectation would be that it would disappear. Last year we had a peak flow 11,000. I think we got 10,300 out of the dam because the lake was so low we didn't have the head to get to 3 or 11,000. But we had two peaks. At 10,300, we put 3,000 cubic yards at Cableway just downstream. And after the flow, it's like, where did the gravel go? It just wasn't there anymore. Perfectly wasn't there anymore. So our big pile that we moved this year appears to have persisted, and we'll see what happens next.
So it looks like we have some questions from the audience. Andy.
Yeah, thanks, John. And this question is for yourself. Well, no, I was debating whether I should ask you any more questions after you called bull trout losers in your talk. You presented one of your tables had the ratios of Q100 to Q2s for the snowmelt, frontal, and thunderstorm systems. If I remember correctly, that was from the 90s. I'm wondering if those ratios have been updated in the last 30 years, and if there's projections with climate change, how those ratios might change.
Yeah, that's a good question. That'd be a great study I did to revisit that data and see how it's changed. Not to my knowledge. I don't know if any of the hydrologists know about things like that, other papers like that. That was a study John Pitlick did a long time ago, mostly in California. So those values are relevant. I think it's all in California, maybe because he looked at the Klamath, it also may have gone into Oregon, but it's locally relevant. Thanks.
All right, my question is for Dave. So if we had a flow regime that was capable of substantially more sediment transport, and I think maybe you kind of got at this at your statement about having to feed the river, would we need, would we need a lot more augmentation if the river was capable of moving a lot more gravel? Or
Yeah, I mean, the faster we transport it out, the more, we'd have to keep replacing it. And, and in this context is something that, we've had discussions with, like my discussions with Kyle, and, I should probably, should come up here and talk about it. But, the idea that with the winter flows, like if we can piggyback on and get the big flows, at Lewiston then could be, 6, 7, 8,000, whatever it is. But we're getting the much bigger flows downriver where we need them, but we don't need to be having 11,000 CFS at Lewiston all the time, just sending all our mobile material gone,
Right. Yeah. And I guess maybe that's kind of a second question then. If we are able to do some piggybacking, do we need to be reaching 11,000 at Lewiston?
Yeah, I would say probably not. Or at least not so frequently,
Okay, thank you.
So, you move more out, more you got to put in. But I think a missing component, and I'm going to tie James into this, is we are really good at growing riparian, and our banks don't change hardly. And so where we find the active bars is where the channel expansions occur mostly. And so if we were to have a flow regime or some management actions that would help, and I'm going to say it this way, you can throw things at me if you need to denude the riparian zone a little bit, rough it up, get rid of it to some extent. What we had on the Trinity before flow regulation was a large expansive gravel bed channel. And now what we have is this beautiful garden of riparian veg that is in most places impenetrable. So if we knock that riparian vegetation back, increased our storage, then maybe higher flows because of piggybacking doesn't equal more gravel augmentation because we have more storage areas to accommodate it. Does that make sense to you, James? A little bit?
I'll just point out that riparian objectives have always included a variable riparian fringe, so not that uniformly encroached bank that you see. That is considered not really what we're looking for. Diversity of age classes and a diversity of riparian width is desirable and considered healthy. So disturbing the riparian corridor isn't at all a bad thing.
Maybe just one other thing to add too is I think one of the if you kind of go to that straight channel examples, kind of getting at one of the earlier questions about being able to recruit material, relocating the channel, like one of the examples that we saw today, and I think most projects are doing that. Many of maybe or all the designers are looking to, as part of the relocation, many of them are through dredge tailings and looking for places where, it's not just all boulders and there's slickens. There is some diversity in grain size in the dredge tailings. And I know there are considerations of moving the channel into places that can recruit gravel that's scaled to the post rod flow regime. So that's just another tool that we have in our toolbox.
Thanks. Both of my questions already got asked. but I'm gonna try to build back on them. So I wanted to return to the question about hyporheic flow, and a really similar question about the effects of, what, pre-anthropogenic impacts, presumably the layering of the hyporheic sediment composition was complex from long history of sediment transport and hydrologic history and all that. And then it got washed, the hillsides got washed down and everything got flipped upside down. So now you have both more homogeneous but larger particle sizes. And in one of your slides, it looked like, if I understood it correctly, that in a more complex matrix, there's modulation of diel temperature variation because you have different residence times for water through the substrate. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on the effects of that change in substrate composition on temperature in both, like, maybe at the reach scale or the whole river scale. I'm not really sure what scale to think about it, but it seems like there should be some effect there.
This is another very interesting question. So, like all the others, and it shows a little bit the complexity of the systems, because the rivers are not just the surface water; is actually the entire valley corridor, both what we see in the surface, but also what move into the subsurface, because both energy and organism can move through the pores from one location to another one. And energy, like temperature, is an important ingredient for an healthy environment. So changing the roughness that it was present there. So changing not just the grain side texture, but changing also the amount of wood that is present there, the amount of large roughness on the surface, and also the formation of going from a single channel to potentially a multi-thread channel. So you have channels with different elevations. So you started to increase the vertical and lateral connectivity of the river with the floodplain. And in doing that, and also the exchange of energy between different parts of the alluvial valley. So in a probably before human intervention and disturbance, potentially the valley floor was a lot more complex, so there was more transfer of energy between one place and the other one. And with that, so warmer water could create a much more responsive, higher productivity inside. The microbial community depends on the temperature that is present there. So having these waves of daily fluctuations that enter the sediment create in the near hyporheic zone a more productive potentially areas. As the resident times get longer and longer, then that the daily fluctuation becomes smaller. So that the memory basically is forgotten, but there is that seasonal variations. So you still have this heat wave during the summer that still keep on moving during the winter into the substrate. So having it is a longer flow path can create a more warmer aquifer or shallow aquifer where organisms can take advantage of that environment. Thank you.
I've seen a lot of TRP presentations where we show an aerial photo of the historic channel or valley bottom. But granted, those photos were 60, 70 years after there was extensive mining in the valley. How confident are you all that those photos are a good representation of what the river looked like and functioned like prior to all that human disturbance?
I don't know the answer to that question, but unfortunately, Andreas, who was with the program, did look at that pretty extensively. Part of his study was to look at the earliest aerial photos, and Dave may have the dates better than I do. But it was a much Well, you want to pick up on that?
I mean, the earliest aerial photos are 1944, and we, a lot of us have spent a lot of time looking at those, and the place was just completely hammered. It's no resemblance to what was there before the miners got there. So I guess that's pretty easy to answer. Maybe I'm missing something.
Well,
Oh, I'm not sure about, well, I've seen, yeah, right. I was actually maybe thinking earlier than that. There's a book, it's in the library. You can check it out. It's called Annals of Trinity County, and it was a collection of observations from early residents like in the 1860s. And they talk about the mud ranch around Lewiston and out the fertile soil there. And the author was envisioning in 20 years it would all be gone because of the gold dredge. Big orchards around Weaver Creek that supplied miners and other people in the area. But a lot of this speaks to actually a pretty productive floodplain environment that likely would have had supported a pretty good forest, and sure, big flows in that environment, big river and everything. But I don't think that the early aerials are reflective at all of what the pre-disturbance river looked like.
Maybe I should have said it, because it seems like often I hear us discuss it like it's an aspiration to try to replicate some of the things that we've seen historically, believing that that's the way, the desired future state of the channel, of the valley. And there's probably a lot of danger in making presumptions like that.
Yeah. Apparently there were big salmon runs back in those days. So I think that's what people think of when they think of historic conditions and what those meant to fish, at least. But
yeah, I think we just need to be careful when we talk about historical conditions that we're very specific on what pieces that we're talking about.
the point I would make is that restoration occurs across the spectrum, and true restoration is restoring to the original condition. And at this point, there's no way that we can restore the original condition. We've altered the flow. The valley floor is gone. What we're doing is rehabilitation. We're trying to convert the river back to a functional form that has some of the attributes that we think are important to the fishery and river health. But we can't go back to that historical condition. It's just not going to be possible. It's a template to strive for, but we have to distinguish between what we want and what's possible.
Well put.
Yeah, I think those are good points to make about whether you're doing, whether you're restoring it to the original condition, which in most cases is not possible, particularly given the changes in flow, or just creating a functioning river ecologically and physically. I think those are good points. There was just to interject, there was a related question online about the observation that old growth systems with wood debris and riparian forests are resistant or resilient to disturbances. And the question really is there any ancestral or tribal knowledge about the pre-mining form of the river and the riparian vegetation that you might try and emulate or make use of in terms of a functioning river? Not to say that you're going to restore it to that form, but to learn from what was effective in the pre-disturbance state. And I don't know if that might be an interesting question to raise with your tribal partners.
I think it's a resource that we haven't tapped, and certainly it would be something we should behoove us to look into.
Yeah, I think that I'm pretty sure maybe some other folks here can remind me too, but when we were doing the large wood management work that DJ and others were working on, I think that there was a fair amount of historical ecology research that had went into that process. Because I remember that's where a lot of those old photos came from, like from Trinity Center. Maybe Kyle remembers. No, but it'd probably be worth checking in with DJ on that, or I guess Andreas, unless Dave, you remember.
Kyle?
Yeah, I've kind of got an in the weeds question for Daniele and Todd. Daniele got me thinking about the long flow lines through meander bends in a river system in the hyperrheic flow, and Todd's talk about thermal stratification yesterday. And I was just wondering, oftentimes, as Andreas described, we'll have the channel on one valley wall for a very long period of time, and then it'll cross. That first pool might have a benefit of that, and I was wondering if you thought that hyperrheic flow lines through meander bends could strengthen thermal stratification.
No, that's a very good question. So there is a balance, but to answer that question, there are a lot of variables that needs to occur simultaneously. One is the fact that the stream bed needs to be permeable enough that support a good amount of discharge that come from the hyperrheic. The other one is how much flow comes from the rivers. So if the flow is very strong, then the ratio between the discharge from hyperrheic and the discharge on the surface water starts to be too large. Then the amount of cold temperature that comes from the hyperrheic is overwhelmed by the characteristics of the streams. The other one is how cold the hyperrheic is. So if it comes from the previous, let's say, meander, and he has the memory of, let's say, the springs, so it will carry a certain temperature, maybe something in the order of 10 degrees or 7 degrees Celsius. But if it is then still longer, it might have even a lower one. But if the time scale is shorter, it might be even warmer. So then the difference in temperature between the surface and the subsurface could be minimum. Areas where hyperrheic and groundwater becomes important is area where we might have some bedrock outcrop that then push the groundwater and the hyperrheic up, and in that characteristically you funnel and then you concentrate that hyperrheic in an area, and in that case you are able to create some cold spot that can potentially preserve the stratification longer, or create areas in the stream bed that generate cold pool of water that can be detected by area photograph, for instance. There are research that shows that you can actually detect it is upwelling of cold water, groundwater, or hyperrheic water in side of rivers. But those one are typically features that happen along the river network, and depends on these variables, areas where you have strong upwelling, low conductivity, and low temperature of the hyperrheic compared to the one of the stream. And Todd, do you have something else?
Yeah, just one little addition to that is on the Umatilla River in Oregon. That's what was observed is that the travel times for hyperrheic flow were such in this particular pool riffle complex that the cold water that started its path through the hyperrheic zone got to the river or at the pool at the time of day that the stratification might otherwise be starting to break down. And so in that way, the stratification was sustained for a longer period under those conditions. So hyperrheic flows can, I would imagine, strengthen and elongate the time for stratification to be formed. But I can imagine situations in the field where the opposite may occur because of the missed time between hyperrheic temperatures and surface temperatures. So it's a complex world out there. It's like side by side.
And I guess I would add, just topographically, the pool bottoms are places where you're naturally going to get upwelling of hyperrheic flow, wherever it's coming from. And so if if it's colder because it's traveled some distance, that may help to keep the pool bottom cold. And then there are some studies in Oregon and bedrock rivers where you're getting groundwater upwelling through bedrock fractures into those pool bottoms. I guess I was wondering if any of your pools were bedrock floored, and you've got some of those interactions too.
Our UT pool was bedrock mantled at its inlet. I don't know about any fracturing or those types of cold water sources. Hard to say. We wanted to do so much more there, but what we did was pushing it already.
Yeah, and I guess we wandered off into yesterday's talks, which I think is fair game. So if you want to discuss other things we've discussed this week, I think that's fine.
Yeah, question for Daniele. You talked a lot about hyporheic flow in the channel, but pretty much everywhere we've looked in the floodplain, even if it's former floodplain that's been buried with tailings, if you dig down deep enough, you hit groundwater that's roughly the same elevation as the water surface elevation of the river, suggesting a strong hyporheic connection to groundwater a long ways from the channel. And it seems like it's an unknown but potentially huge source of water that is available to interact with the river, but it's a very different quality and temperature. Is this important? Is this something that we should be thinking about? It seems like it'd be very important in a unregulated system as a source of water in the summer that's not tapped into now. But so any things we should be thinking about with that?
I think it is because, as I was saying before, looking at the river just within the banks of the river, I think is not quite the right view of a river system. The river system has the entire floodplain. So also the water that is into the pore interstices of the floodplain is still part of the river. So is as a whole that we can restore it. That water is there and enables the riparian vegetation to grow, and the root will evolve to be able to tap that water at that level. So any type of change then in the water level that can impact the water table in that particular location, especially if the river is very strongly dynamically connected with that water table. So if the water table is very similar to the water surface elevation in the streams, that highlight to me that the two systems are in balance, so there is no gaining and losing. There is mostly the valley slope that basically keep both the groundwater and the river flow moving. And so there is this connection that brings water and energy to the plant there. If there is a disconnection, so then there will be less nutrient to get to the plant, less opportunity to bring energy to those plants, but also the fauna that is present there. A lot of microinvertebrates can move through the sediment, and they will get to those locations, just borrowing through that, but also particle. So phosphorus can move attached to particle, and those one can move through the pores and can be transported into the floodplain to bring some resources.
Just maybe one more vignette about hyporheic flows. I'm certainly no expert, but kind of a earth-shattering observation for me was actually looking at hyporheic flows in the wintertime too. Just kind of one vignette project on the Van Dusen River, which is very dynamic compared to the Trinity. Looking at winter flows, the turbidity is very high there for long periods of time. When juveniles are rearing, they've emerged from the gravels upstream and they're rearing their way down to the main stems. And it's 100, 500, 1,000 NTU of turbidity. And it's like, how do they feed and grow in that kind of situation? And this one great example, we were out in winter base flows and it was chocolate milk as usual. But we were in a section where the river had avulsed 5 years ago or so, and there's a long alcove that was probably 1,200, 1,500 feet long. And there was probably 50 CFS of hyporheic flow coming through the bar, the point bar, into the alcove. And that alcove, about 1,200 feet, was like clear. And it was like, holy cow, if I was a fish in this chocolate soup, you know, where am I going to be? But it also kind of gets you to thinking about how much hyporheic flow on a meander bend like that is coming through in the summertime, for if there's like a high flow scour channel alcove at the top end of the pool, how that can be coming through the bar and providing quite a bit of potential thermal refugia locally that isn't mixed just by, you know, high dam releases of 450 CFS if we have that kind of channel complexity. So both kind of winter and summer benefits.
Ken.
Thanks. So I'm sure some of you have heard this. I'm not a geomorphologist, so first test my assumption here. I assume that natural sources of sediment to the river are from a wide range of sizes, from like clay, fine particles to large boulders. We only put in a very narrow range of that size class. And so what are the implications for only ever augmenting, you know, fish rock, you know, gravel of one particular size on channel morphology, channel evolution, et cetera?
I think a lot of people should jump in on this. But you know, I think it depends on the. When I think of just putting in fish rock, I do think about upstream near Lewiston Dam, where we've put in a bunch of fish rock, and there's no fines. That's got some not good implications. The substrate it's you know, some of the stuff Todd was talking about. You know, I'm not sure that if we get downriver, I'm not, you know, where there is more of a natural supply of stuff. I'm not sure that we can put in enough fish rock to really matter, you know. But it'll winnow if there's too much of that, not enough coarse stuff, it'll winnow itself out eventually, you know. That's, I guess, my first thought. So who wants to talk about it now?
Yeah, well, the lack of fines is to me the most striking attribute of that upper reach. And so that we've not had a natural grain size distribution implemented up there for so long. I mean, it affects so many different things. We have a narrower range of grain sizes, a lower diversity of sediment sizes for sorting, and we've got I think we have sorting problems to begin with. I don't know how the grain size influences that perceived problem, but our flows are so short-lived that we have very few opportunities for sorting to occur. So what I see in the Trinity River is an overall, I mean, I'm talking on the reach scale or even the restoration reach. I don't see reaches that exhibit sorting that I see in unimpeded river channels. So how that plays in the grain size distribution, I'm not sure, but in terms of our flows interacting with the grain size distribution, the lack of sorting, I don't think is a healthy thing for the populations we're trying to support with our actions. And maybe winter flows will help with that sorting problem, is my hope. We'll see. We've got data on it. We can track it. If we can implement the winter flows, we'll be able to test that hypothesis.
I'm going to send this to you guys in a minute, but I had one more comment on that, and it Todd made me think of. And, you know, besides the lack of fines upriver, the way we sort, and he's talking about the river sorting, but it made me think of how we sort things with a sorting plant, with a gravel plant. And what our fish rock also lacks is 1- material. So we don't have like 1/2 inch, 3/8 inch, whatever, fine gravel. There's none of that in because just functionally, if you put in the smaller screen you use for your bottom screen, the more difficult it becomes to, operationally create that material. And so we're missing all the pea gravel and all that kind of thing. And I think that's something that's another problem too.
And that's part of what I mean by like just the complete range of natural grain size. I think of, we drive the Trinity or the 299 all the time. And I think that giant slide at Salyer always strikes me as like, oh, this is what natural large scale sediment recruitment looks like. And you look at that hill slope and it's like everything from like fine sediment that comes down rivulets to boulders the size of that table.
So the debris flows are something that we're not seeing as much anymore, but I've been up in the up above the lower end of the project reach above Junction City and looked at the streams up there. And what's really interesting is that even on the tributaries up on the hill slope, there's no fines. All that material was washed out by the miners. So we don't get a natural contribution even in that material of fines. Just a vignette, which I'm going to use in all my speeches instead of saying a story.
I guess a couple things. It really kind of, well, I guess first of all, I wouldn't see us just putting in fish rock. I think there's a wide range of objectives and coarse sediment management that we need to think about. And some of it might be more traditional gravel augmentation or coarse sediment augmentation like at Lewiston Weir. But there's also a lot that's going in with individual design projects too. So, we've had skeletal bars and all these different grain sizes that are performing different functions. And those objectives may vary longitudinally. So like, for example, I think Dave said this, but it doesn't make sense to put fish rock in down at Junction City because you got more than enough. But upstream, we should have a full range of grain size, including sand. And that's, and then one other thing too, if we can make better use of tributary deltas and the full range of grain sizes that are coming in from tributaries by synchronizing high flows with tributary generation, you're going to probably make better use of the materials that are coming out of tributaries that include the full grain size range. Because when they're out of phase, there's some that gets deposited in the river and then capped with a armor layer on it. And then the dam releases may not have access to, the material down below that it would have if we would have synchronized those flows. So I think we've got to use all these tools in our toolbox.
So this is for Dave and Scott. How did the delta, the tributary inflows compare to our augmentation amounts? I was just wondering if, if it's orders of magnitude more and compared to our efforts with the trying to move it with a bulldozer as opposed to having the river move it.
I think it just depends on the water year, but and how much is contributing. And I have those numbers someplace, but I remember like Rush Creek was in the 10 to 30,000 cubic yards, and just the type of water year. Like one of my examples, and I don't know the exact numbers, but the difference between the 1997 and 1998 flood, the 1997 flood put 3 times or 4 times more sediment from Rush Creek, even though it was only a wet water year, whereas 98 was an extremely wet year and had a very small fraction just in how the water came off the watershed. So 97 flood was just high magnitude, fairly short duration, and then nothing. And 98 was more snow melt and more moderate, but more volume. And so it makes a huge difference in delivery to the main stem.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that makes that a difficult question is that so much of that depends on what the condition of that watershed is. And, Rush Creek, there was some bedload sampling up in Rush Creek back in the 90s, and that showed much higher rates of transport out of that watershed than, I think it continued until 2003 or 2004, and it really decreased, from that peak. And, I'm not really sure why, but it's super variable. I think another thing that makes that a little difficult is that, and I can't remember for sure, and Scott probably knows, but a lot of times when the sediment fluxes out of a tributary are reported, you're getting the entire sediment flux. And it's may or may not be like, most of it's probably sand. And it's not always clear, that, oh, this is the gravel and this is the sand. You'll just get the total. I don't know. Do you remember how that works with like Rush Creek?
It just depends on how you're measuring it. So if it's like bed load transport, yeah, you're getting the full range. But we did a lot of the delta surveys too that looks at it volumetrically, which you're only getting a fraction of it because a lot of those fines are moving through the system. So those are kind of two different measurements.
So not a geomorphologist, but anybody that's interested in sediment in the Trinity River, I encourage you to keep an eye on Indian Creek. It's really easy to get to. It's right off 299 between Weaverville and Redding. And if you visit it periodically, you'll see almost every winter, thousands of cubic yards of sediment deposited right there at the delta. And then as soon as our rod flows recede, it's gone. And, just I can't put a number on it, but to think that that's just one tributary and above the dam, there were many of that scale. It's just kind of staggering what the sediment load would be even in a rescaled river. Quite a bit more, I think, than what we're putting in right now.
Yeah, so Nate Bradley and I published a paper on the deltas, Russian Indian Creek deltas, and there's sediment as contributions of sediment contributed by each of those systems from dam closure through, I think, 2021 or something. So those values are in there. It's not just, the properly synchronized flows between the main stem and the tribs, but it's the time between the floods in those systems. What we saw in our report is Rush Creek. Yeah, you get right now we're getting the sediments contributed to the delta, and then the spring flows are so late that the veg starts to establish on those. And so it's just that banding effect that James talked about is moving the deltas further out into the valley. And you can calculate how long it's going to take for Indian Creeks. Those delta sediments are moved, but not very far because there's those big bars just downstream. Those are the delta sediments. Those are growing at rates that quantified, I think 22 years before we're going to have to start worrying about Highway 299 and a couple houses at Rush Creek that are going to be threatened in the next 30 years if it keeps going the way it's going. So winter flows would assist tributary sediment dispersion and help protect infrastructure.
Final word. Okay.
My question has been answered a few times just in the minute that I've stood up here. Scott did a really thorough job. My question was sort of leaning towards Dave, but then John asked the question directly again. But I'm reminded of the picture that Seth showed us of Deadwood Creek and that huge plume of fines that's sitting there at the confluence. And if there had been winter flows piggybacked on top of that storm event, is that amount of contribution of fines in the target area that you're looking for, or is that an insufficient amount of sediment to try to use when you're thinking about this augmentation of fines? And I would follow up by saying I've only had a little bit of chance to look around while I've been down here, but I see the same thing happening at Weaver Creek, where the delta has a graded there, and there's a big slug of fine sediment just sitting there perched above the main stem.
Yeah, those Deadwood Creek sediments that was shown in the grain size distribution we measured after that plume got wiped out by the spring flows, it's just gets swallowed by the bed. And then because of transport processes and the deficit of fines, there's no supply there. They just keep moving downstream. They don't stay there very long. So I calculated how many cubic yards of fines it would take to fill the bed from Lewiston to Rush Creek with a target of, I think, 20%. And it was such a large number, I didn't put it in the report because I didn't think anyone would believe me. But it's a lot.
Okay, so yeah, so just that huge slug we saw in the photo is a small amount compared to what you really think you might need.
Yeah, but we wouldn't want to just, build a bed all at once.
Sure.
It would be a process that we try to emulate.
Very good, thank you.
This is a really compelling discussion, so it's great. I've got a question for Sarah. We've been trying to implement a flow regime for the last several years that redistributes the rod flow volumes to address more functional flows components at different times of year. And then we heard yesterday 2 other methodologies that have been developed to potentially do the same thing on Clear Creek and in the Trinity. And then you presented again today a very similar technique that could be employed to do that. Is it more important that we continue to develop these methods or that we actually do something and learn from it?
Love that question. You should absolutely start doing something. There's a lot of great methods that have been developed. It kind of goes back to the slide where we know we have over 200 environmental flow methods out globally that are being used on a regular basis. So yeah, in summary, I think it's time to, it's time to try. It's time to start doing. But that is exactly what the Trinity program has been doing. And as John said, pulling your different levers. Okay, we have an environmental flow regime that's been implemented, different channel augmentation strategies. Maybe time to revisit the flow regime, see the effects. It's an iterative, ongoing process. That is what adaptive management is about. I'm not sure how many folks here are aware of the discussions that were happening in Sacramento. I think it was just last week or so, talking about winter run Chinook and some of the strategies they're thinking to preserve winter run. And a lot of people are like, we're here now. There will not be fish in 5 to 10 years. They've shut down the commercial salmon fishery again this year. It's time to do stuff. We have lots of things we can do. We have methods that we can do that we know we can try out and put into place. The tools are there. There's 3 different methods. We were just talking about how to implement winter flows, not knowing what your water year is going to type or what your water year is going to be. Great, pick one, start doing it, and adjust as we go. So that's my plug. There you go. Well, anybody else?
Yeah, this is a question back to you, Sarah. So we do have an endangered species, and I'm wondering how you frame experimental actions, and how do you you can't run a 5 years of testing. How do you conduct an experiment in an environment like this, and how can you make sense out of the results?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's a good philosophical debate. In some places where you're continuing to see salmon populations spiral down year after year after year, there's a trajectory where there's no more fish. So do you continue to study and make sure that your next action you put in is the best that you can do, and you still don't have certainty that it may or may not arrest that decline? Or is your population small but relatively stable, in which case you have a timeline where you could potentially implement actions and do something about it, or study and make sure that the actions that you're implementing are the best that you think you can do. So those might be different situations. The winter run situation I brought up because they are quite certain that they only have so much time left until there's no more fish, right? It's all hatchery fish. A lot of the hatchery fish are not making it. They started last year, 2 years ago, they're trucking fish around Shasta. They're at that point. So when you're at that point where you're already there at the precipice, it's a risk reward situation that is a social decision that has to be made as a policy decision. And science can try to help inform that policy decision. But at the end of the day, what do we want to do, right? Like what is our societal opinion going to be that in terms of where we're at? So the endangered species thing is hard. Fall run Chinook are threatened in a lot of places, but they're not quite on that precipice yet. But give it another 10 years, that could change. So you might have different risk decisions that you make depending on the population, but I think that science can help inform that. I'm also an experimental scientist, right? That's what everybody here is. We're all here evaluating these experiments. And so, yeah, I might be biased towards trying that experiment and learning from failure and readjusting, as I said earlier. But it's a good question.
So there are two levels that is answered that we can answer the question. One is from the science part, and one is the implementation part. So from the science part, there is this knowledge that the organism adapted to the natural flow. So flows that mimic the natural flow should be beneficial to the species, and a lot of science move toward that direction. So complexity in the flow has an indirect impact on modulating different type of habitat that are beneficial to different species, but also for the same species in different life stages. And that impact not just the surface species, but also how energy and connectivity change within the river network. So how, for instance, hypertrophic move is impacted also by how the stage change, because the flow lines change depending on the discharge. So you changing the flow is a piece of heterogeneity. So in ecology, there is this notion that increasing heterogeneity up to a certain point is beneficial because it increases biodiversity. So science can bring and provide this concept and the support a certain implementation. Then there is the choice of the implementation. So if we want to implement more natural flow, that's the first decision that needs to be taken. Once that one is agreed upon, then there is how we do it. And then there is the different technique that can be taken. But it's important to make sure that the different stakeholders agree on a certain concept, on a certain philosophy on how the system works. And that's where science is important, because it can provide those data and the support for a certain direction. The other caveat is that science is dynamic. So as we monitor and we learn, we better turn that knob. So there was a huge part is to move from constant hydrograph. The fact that the rod has this mimicking part, I think, is very important. That was supported by the knowledge that there was in the 80s and the 90s. And now in the last year, there is another layer of notion and knowledge that we learn. And so manipulating that one can better improve that habit. But the first step is to understand that part.
Yeah, and I guess I would add, the program has multiple tools. You're doing monitoring, you're doing implementation, rehabilitation, you've got models and decision support systems. So you can, as you know, I'm preaching to the choir, you can run some models for the different hydrograph options and at least make a prediction about which one might be the better one before you implement it. And then take that to your stakeholders and go through the decision support process.
I don't have a question, but I couldn't help pushing back a little bit on a notion that implementing something like a winter flow would be perceived as an experiment on listed species. I would argue, I think it's become abundantly clear this week that the way that we manage flows is not based on the best available science, and that to not change things based on everything we've learned in 25 years is, approaching malpractice. So I don't think it's should be couched as experimental. It should be couched as implementing the best science. And the longer that we delay that, I think the more we put ourselves at risk, and we put the species at risk.
I think you won the crowd with that one. So maybe the proper way to phrase it is it's an adaptive management exercise, that we're trying things based on our best science, and as everyone says, with the models and the monitoring, that we learn from it and adjust.
Okay, I have another question from the online. This one was directed to Daniele, but I think Todd can also address this. With the decline of salmon populations on the Trinity, we've seen a reduction in the formation of reds. How does this loss affect other river processes?
Well, you as well can answer this, John. I mean, experts abound. So salmon spawning has a number of different effects in the river. Daniele talked about the effect of red structures on hyperetic flows. And then you can't ignore that the salmon that come in to make these reds die and contribute nutrients that catalyze the biologic productivity. Those reds then capture some of those nutrients, and the travel times can be changed through for those nutrients through the hyperetic zone because of those structures. The spawning itself in high densities can generate form drag that helps stabilize those spawning beds. And so there's a beneficial feedback between large numbers of spawners and the stability of the stream bed for incubation. So more salmon, more stability, perhaps better survival. So these are the things that first come to mind in terms of the hyperetic effects and the stability effects of spawning in gravel bed channels. You have any to add?
Only one that is important actually to highlight is that reds also salmoni by creating reds move sediment. So they wash out fine sediment as they create those reds, and they move sediment downstream. So it's also a mechanism in certain conditions that create movement of a bed load and removing fine sediment. So it's just more than retaining nutrient or creating an habitat for fish, is actually helping the river maintain its conditions.
Yeah, over generations of fish spawning, the historic runs that we had where it was wall-to-wall fish, turning over that gravel on generational bases, created this optimal habitat in the long term for them.
Yeah, Daniele's comment made me think, the place where we have this deficit of fines and the place where we have the most salmonid spawning coincide and maybe exacerbate one another. We also have a legacy concrete weir structure that spans the river below that location. And we also know we need to continue to add gravel there in perpetuity because it's directly below the dam. It seems like a really complex problem that we've not solved. And I'm just wondering, those of you familiar with the setup there of the proximity of that concrete weir structure and the sediment routing and the additions of such a narrow range of grain sizes and the fact that the salmon are winnowing away anything smaller than that. If there's any thoughts about how we deal with this really important, really productive area that's so altered and so highly used.
My caveat is that I don't know yet the system, so I don't know exactly how it works. But one thing to consider is the fact that as they create the red, one of the characteristics is that the larger particle get embedded. So the fish automatically buried or make the larger particle at the bottom of the reds, and they use basically the large space among the larger particle where they lay the eggs. Then they lay the other layers, and there is a fine layer of sediment and then a coarser layer on the top again. So there is an architecture inside the red itself. It's only the very fine material that is washed out. So something that is in the order of the sand or probably very, very fine gravels. So about 6 millimeter and lower is the one that they can move it. But the other one remain there. So the coarse particle remain in their locations. From my observation is that reds are salmonid also try to spawn where the gravel is very loose. So where you have debris farm that has been cleaned up and you have it is a very loose gravel. So those are areas that they can use. especially because it's easier for them to move. They can detect that there is a strong downwelling or upwelling flows that moves through those gravels, so they can see that they can perceive that the habitat could be conducive to bring oxygen-rich flows to the eggs. So that's as much as I can answer or address your question. Other than know better the system.
Yeah, I would expect that, the spawning that occurs near the dam where the grain size is so coarse, albeit loose, those particles are quite loose because there isn't any finer stuff to help cement them in, and it gets mobilized frequently because it's so close to the dam where the water is sediment hungry, so it moves a lot of sediment. But when you think about how a salmon builds a redd, some of those rocks don't get moved, they get moved into the egg pocket instead. But the gal has to build that pocket in order for the big particles to fall in there and stay. But if you have to move a whole bunch of big particles to build a redd in the absence of fines to help lubricate those larger particles' movement by the tail action, you're probably beating the hell out of yourself as a fish, and your redds are probably smaller and potentially less structurally beneficial to the incubation. On top of that, with the large pore spaces between these large grains and the chaotic flow that can occur in the egg pocket, egg abrasion is real and it kills fish. So I would expect that even though we have all of that spawning occurring near the dam under these conditions that we've been talking about, we probably have lower egg to fry survival because of that abrasion that occurs in those egg pockets. That would be my guess. But you guys are studying it, right? So we'll find out.
Okay, an online question for Sarah. The question is, have you successfully implemented the functional flow model that you presented to us on any systems? And if so, are there preliminary results that you can describe?
Well, the Trinity River is one of our functional flow environmental flow programs that we point to when we get asked this question, actually. The two cases we talk about the most in California are Trinity River Restoration Program, purpose flows that you'll all have been working on, and then Poudre Creek. And Poudre Creek is, if you're not familiar with it, it's one of the drains into one of the west side tributaries that drains into the Sacramento down in the lower area. That was has Berryessa Dam above it. It was highly degraded system and incised, completely dominated by non-native species. They implemented a flow accord, not unlike the ROD decisions here in 2000. And since then, and essentially instituted a more natural flow regime. They do fault pulses. They allow winter pulses to spill through the dam. They don't have quite a nicely shaped full spring pulse and long recession, but they do have a small spring pulse, a shelf to hold for the spring, and then down to summer base flows that are actually elevated. They had a great response in the fisheries down there, a return to a dominance by the native fish community in the upper 15 to 20 miles. The temperature is warm in the lower part of the creek, so that non-natives still reside down there. But that flow regime essentially keeps the non-natives down in the lower part of the creek. And although there are some non-natives in the upper part, it's 80 to 90% natives. So that flow regime is giving the native fish that competitive advantage, that ability to really occupy the reaches there. Some subsequent follow-up work that has just been happening in the last couple of years is to reevaluate that flow regime. So they also implemented a flow regime, went through habitat restoration efforts, and are back to reevaluating their flow regime. And there's suggestions and recommendations to potentially do something a little bit different with their spring and summer flows and maybe ramp down more slowly. I don't know if it'll be implemented, but this next round of adjustments to the flow regime, but those discussions are happening very similar to what's happening here as well. So those are two California examples. I might also add that there was a paper that just came out in 2023 led by Angela Arthington that discusses implementation of environmental flow regimes globally. And essentially also advocating for getting out and doing more. You look globally at how many flow regimes have actually been implemented, and it's actually quite a small number if you think about the global rivers. And so there's that paper highlights challenges and opportunities that people are facing globally about environmental flow implementation. And Arthington's the lead author on that. Of interest.
I have a question for the program and the partners and the panelists. Based on my presentation, this idea that we're going through climate change, and have you looked at how the distribution of water year types is changing or not, and thought about that in terms of planning? Like, is it trending towards more drier periods? I know you've just gone through a drought recently, but has anyone looked at that over the historical record and then through into the current day?
I haven't really done anything formal with that, but it seems to me, and everybody else can tell me if I'm lost my mind or whatever, that we don't get normal anymore. We get drought and we get wet. And that's what I've been seeing the last decade or so.
I can kind of answer that a little bit. So the way we were talking about this out in the hall, the original bins, the 5 water year bins were set up, and Scott knows this well, because I think he's the one that did it, but we have normal has a lower probability of occurrence than wet or dry. And so I think it's 12% for critically dry, 28% for dry, 20% for normal, 28% for wet, and 12% for extremely wet. So the distribution is kind of like a camel's back. And I have recalculated those. So those were based on data to 1994, I believe, 95. And so now we have another 25, 30 years worth of data to add to that. And if you redo those calculations using the same bins, those numbers for wet and dry have gone up some. And so it is getting, drier and wetter. And I think this is actually, and Sarah's talk touched on this a bit with a different method where it's basically a continuum of the percentiles. And I do think this is an important thing for the program to tackle in the future, is kind of reevaluating those, looking at those. One of the reasons why we don't get normal very much anymore is because it had a lower probability of occurrence than dry or wet, but also the weather has gotten more variable. And actually that Salmon River at Sums Bar gauge that I was showing the other day, in around the 50s and 1950s, it became, if you look at the coefficient of variation, it became more variable, much more variable. And so I do think we should kind of reevaluate those bins, and maybe we can structure either new bins or use a different method like a continuum of percentiles that we could show uses a similar amount of water over 100 years or something, so that, because obviously there would be people that would have heartache around, well, who's getting, if we do change that methodology, is there more or less water going down the river? But yeah, I think it's important for the program to tackle that in the future.
Yeah, I guess one comment I would make is the hydrologists that I work with commonly think of the flow in terms of percentiles of the annual flow. And I think that's easy to then translate into low and normal and high flows, even though it might be different bins, but I think people can still relate to that concept. And then you're just dealing with the percentiles, not these bins that you've established necessarily.
Well, hopefully Seth will nod, and Kyle too, but I think this is part of our job with the flow synthesis, is to revisit this. That's been my hopes and dreams as part of the flow synthesis, is to take a comprehensive look at the entirety of the hydrograph, not just pieces of it, including how we do our water year classification. And there's a lot more examples throughout the West Coast now on how they do water year types, and certainly continuous ones. We use a continuous one on the San Joaquin, and it's really helpful, but then you have to deal with risk management. of, if you get your forecast wrong and commit eggs to the basket too early and then it doesn't show up. And one of the really important tools for the upper Tuolumne and probably lower Tuolumne too, and San Joaquin has been the Airborne Snow Observatory program that greatly reduces the uncertainty in runoff, that allows you to reduce the risk of being wrong on your forecasts as you go through the year. So I've made a couple runs, and I think I tried to lobby Mike, if he's still around, to try to get that funded up here. Particularly if we go to a different type of a water year class, that'll be a really important tool for us, I think, to reduce the risk of being wrong, better risk sharing.
Yeah, and I imagine there's legal complications because those water years are defined legally, right? Okay, thank you. Please, yeah.
I had a question for Sarah. I'm just going to kind of beat the dead horse again, but so out of the 5 functional flow components, which ones do we have and which ones are we missing?
Well, looking back at your hydrographs, in the really wet years, it does look like, the spring recession is nailed. It's a beautiful example. We highlighted, it does get talked about. The work does get talked about globally, actually, and outside of California, in case you didn't know. Yeah, that one's nailed. The winter storm flows coming down in winter, when they can do that geomorphic work, would be a great addition. I think I asked you, James, about fall pulses. It's not part of the ROD. It's not something that I think gets released. You did comment that the Bureau will release fall pulses, but then also you made the comment that it seemed like migration cues are perhaps not necessarily limiting, but listening to all of the wonderful research on the hyperrheic zone, there's a lot of other benefits to those first flushing flows as well. There's biogeochemical benefits and other fine sorting sediments that might be a consideration that the program could look at. And then, base flows. Wet season base flows should be higher than dry season base flows in natural systems. There's more water in the winter. There's more water that should come down. The base flows are higher, and that seasonality is an important driver. That's one of the recommendations for Puda Creek too, is to reconsider how those base flows look. We invert our hydrographs when we deliver water in the summer. That's the opposite of what the species have evolved to. So there's always room for improvements, I think, and opportunities. Thanks.
Thanks. Can I ask a quick follow-up too? So we actually do have augmentation flows often in the fall. They're for totally different reasons, and they often occur in August and September. Would you think that those would apply to your fall freshet flows? Or
that's a great question. Typically those flows are coming down when it's cool, when the storms come in September. We get those first atmospheric river events, right? The North Coast kind of has to wet up. Sometimes it's the second storm that really generates runoff in the North Coast before you really start to see that. And so from a holistic ecological point of view, it seems like you'd want to be timing your fall pulses with the timing of the climate coming in. There are years when we don't get rain until December, right? It's for all of the benefits for migration flows that seems that. I think it's a good question to study. It's a highly managed system. I don't know, do those flows provide hyperrheic and biogeochemical benefits that could be happening? Perhaps they're just happening a little earlier. I think it's a good question.
Thank you.
I want to follow up. So I'm thinking on the coastal streams, those first couple storms are important triggers in our watersheds. One is that, you see the first push of the saline water out of the lower estuaries or the higher part of the estuary, conversion from freshwater or saltwater brackish to fresh. We also see a trigger for resorting of the juveniles who have been upriver. They come down and start to reorganize and find places to set up for the winter. And I'm just curious with the, what other biological triggers would you see? You mentioned the leaf flitter gets turned over, and does that what happens? What do you expect?
The reason this is one of the components is there is some good literature to support these fall pulses happening at the time. there's actually quite a bit of literature that comes from some of our other Mediterranean climate systems. In places like Australia, they've looked at that biogeochemical cycling and nutrient cycling gets kickstarted when first storms come through. So that research isn't particular to California, but it's a highly seasonal system that operates in a very similar way that ours does. So there's other research out there. I think from a California perspective, you have, it's the biggest one is the fish migration. You know, there's multiple fish species that are coming up. I don't know from a benthic macroinvertebrate point of view. I'm not a specialist in that. I don't know if there's a resetting with some of the benthic species. That's an interesting question. Where's our bug friends to help us answer that question? But yeah, the flushing and the nutrient cycling and the flushing of the fines and the turnover and the activation of the hypereoic zone, there are very nice studies that show those processes as being supportive. Anybody else want to?
I'm going to stand up for the frogs and cite Don yesterday. Is that a danger if we just pick and choose different aspects to put into our flow regime without considering the full flow regime? Is, I believe, Don, correct me if I'm wrong, but if Hoopa boat dance flows, August, September, Klamath augmentation flows, those wouldn't be harmful if we had the flows scheduled so that the frogs weren't frozen out and delayed in the first place. So an idea just to throw out there is Hoopa boat dance flows, could they occur when those freshets occur or would occur naturally? We can't, under the ROD, release those fall freshets. We tried and they said no. But the Hoopa ceremonial dance gets authorized every other year. And that's not ROD water. So that's free water to the river. So something to consider, but not in the apps. We can't continue, it sounds like to me, to preserve or benefit the frogs in the absence of flows earlier in the year that can match their life cycle requirements.
So I'm going to defer to Kiana for a minute. Is this our last question from Eric? Okay. All right. You're the last one. Make it good.
I'm not sure this is the most stellar question, but this goes primarily to Sarah, but also to others. And I want to preface a little bit that I see a myriad of ecological values to having winter peak flows. But my question is kind of around the shaping of those. And we've been talking a lot about scaled and doing these really sharp peaks during winter. But if we think about the pre-mining condition of the landscape, we recognize that looking at our aerial photography or even other photographs that we have, historical photographs, that's already a very disturbed system. And our watersheds were probably in a much less disturbed state prior to the mining, prior to Europeans arriving. And that would suggest that they were probably better able to absorb storm events, and those peaks might have been a bit attenuated. And so in shaping our winter peaks, do we really want to do specifically a scaling of them, or do we want to consider attenuating those a little bit?
I'll throw out my thoughts, but I'd love to hear folks who know the system better. You know, I don't work up here, so you all know your system a lot better. Typically what you see, and at least I can speak to this by looking at, from having looked at a lot of flow regimes around California, the winter peaks and those rain events have very rapid, you know, it's like it can be overnight, right? The river can go from 50 CFS to like 10,000 CFS in the matter of 24 hours, 48 hours. That's nature. That's how these storms come in. They all have an attenuation on them. All sort of flashy events do. And we see up and down the state that those rates of change on those flashy events are pretty high, but they're often, we've actually looked at this for some of the Sierra rivers, they're often not more than about 30 to 40% per day. When we cut off flows below dams, we often do it at like 80%, 100%, 120% per day, right? Like they're really quite steep. So there is a natural attenuation to winter peaks and winter rain and rain events. We see this in the Coast Range, right? The way that the rain events attenuate off. They're They're rapid at the top, but then they do tail out at the bottom. And we can look to a variety of hydrographs to give us clues about how nature would shape those. Those are very different than the snowmelt recessions, right? Or the long drawn out spring recessions where you're draining groundwater out of the watershed. Those are much lower. Typically, they often don't go more than about 15, maybe 20% at the upper end in terms of a percent decrease per day. That's the percent number I'm talking about. So we can use those to guide our movement. One of the things in terms of whether or not you think that shape of a hydrograph is going to be effective in doing the geomorphic work that you would want to do in wintertime is probably something you have data to answer and could be looked at. And that's going to be sediment supply dependent as they discovered in the Grand Canyon, right? Long duration, high flow events, when you run out of supply, you start eroding what you have. So if you're looking at the upper reaches and you don't have a good supply or you're worried about your gravel, you might want them to be pretty short duration. Turn over the gravel, drop it out, deposit it before it can move potentially too far down. Maybe you want a short pulse. If you're in the lower reaches and you're wanting to kind of reshape and resort, maybe you want a little bit of a longer tail on your recession to give more time for that sediment to move around the channel and continue to migrate as the flows more gradually decrease. But I think that's something actually the program might have good data potentially to explore some areas in that. And if you all want to weigh in.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying about the short peaks and not what we found is that there's a lot of hysteresis, clockwise hysteresis in the sediment transport relationships, and so there's a lot more flux happening on the rise and peak, and even with a couple of peaks, we've done experiments with this where we've had the same peak twice, in the same year, and the second peak doesn't do near as much as the first peak, but so you're going to get not that different of a geomorphic response of whether you have a peak that lasts a day or 2 days or 3 days, but so you're correct about that. But yeah.
Again, I want to thank our panelists for a great discussion and great presentations, and the audience here and in virtual land. Thank you.